the organizing committee for the opportunity to present our research this morning. And I'm going to be focusing on an area that I think has received considerably less attention than survivorship, and that's the social functioning of these survivors. And I'm going to hope to delve into that in some more detail and talk about how that's related to some of the neurocognitive effects that have been more well established. So as you're all well aware, these survivors are at risk for long-term neurocognitive impairment as well as social deficits. And in childhood and adolescence, these social deficits typically take the form of social isolation, withdrawn behavior, or peer rejection. However, we know significantly less about social functioning in long-term adult survivors. And most of what we know is based on reported attainment outcomes. So survivors report that they're not employed, they're not living independently, they're not getting married at the same rate as their peers. But we know very little beyond those crude social indicators. So in that context, the aims of our study were to describe social cognition and social health in long-term adult survivors of CNS tumors, to investigate predictors of social cognition, and to finally examine associations between social cognition and social attainment. To do this, we utilized the St. Jude Lifetime Cohort Study, and this is a longitudinal prospective study at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital designed to evaluate health outcomes in aging adult survivors of pediatric cancer. To be eligible for this cohort, survivors were treated for their primary cancer diagnosis at St. Jude, are currently over 18 years of age, and at least 10 years from their primary diagnosis. We also had study-specific eligibility, and that was that survivors fell into one of 4 cohorts. So our first cohort were survivors who did not receive cranial radiation therapy. Our second cohort comprised of survivors who had infratentorial tumors treated with focal irradiation. The third cohort, infratentorial tumor location treated with cranial spinal irradiation. And the fourth cohort, supratentorial tumor location treated with focal irradiation. As a part of the St. Jude Lifetime Cohort Study, survivors come back to campus and undergo a number of clinical batteries, and one of the assessments that they undergo is a neurocognitive assessment. So we traditionally assess domains such as intelligence, attention, memory, processing speed, and executive function. And for our study, we also included assessment of nonverbal processes, as these are believed to be important for social processing. Our primary outcome measure was social cognition. And there are 3 subtests that we used to look at this. The first was affect naming. So for this test, survivors saw a picture of a face and were asked to identify the emotional expression on that face. We next assessed prosody. And for this, survivors heard an audio clip of a speaker and were asked to identify the tone of voice of that speaker. And lastly, we looked at prosody pair matching. So that was the ability to really integrate facial affect recognition with prosody, but also use other cues such as body posture and identifying sarcasm in the speaker's tone of voice. And those 3 subtests gave us a social perception composite, which I'll reference frequently. Survivors, in addition to these performance-based measures, they also reported on their social health and attainment. And for this, we use the NIH Promise questionnaires to look at indices like companionship, social isolation, social support, and the ability to participate in social activities. And then we use the standard social attainment outcomes. So this briefly shows an overview of our sample characteristics. And just to highlight for you, survivors were on average 9 years of age at diagnosis. They were 18 years from diagnosis, with a range from 10 to 41 years. And their current age was an average of 28 years, with a range from 19 to 51 years. And one thing I do want to point out, and this was not unexpected, but survivors of infratentorial tumors treated with CSI had significantly lower global IQ scores than those in the other 3 cohorts. So in terms of our primary outcome, social cognition, so on each of these domains we would expect a mean score of 10 and with a standard deviation of 3. So survivors are performing significantly worse than normative data, but they're still falling largely within that average range when we look at mean scores. When we look at the proportion of survivors who are impaired, however, it tells a slightly different story. So we would expect at 1.5 standard deviations about 7% of survivors to be impaired. And here you see these numbers are grossly larger than that. And what the morbidity ratio tells us is, for example, for affect naming, that survivors, the frequency of impairment on that test for survivors was 2.7 times greater than what it would have been in the general population. So pretty severe impairment on these social cognitive tasks. And we looked at social cognition by the 4 subgroups I had mentioned earlier. And what you can see along the y-axis is the scaled score, with that dark line representing the mean score of 10 and the dashed line at 7 indicating the lower limits of the average range. So you can see a pretty striking difference between the subgroups. So survivors with infantile tumors who were treated with CSI performed significantly worse than each of the other groups and well below the lower limits of the average range. We were interested in looking at other disease and treatment-related predictors of social perception in these survivors. So these are results from a multivariable model, and what you can see is that still what persisted was the infantile CSI group, and that's relative to the no CRT group. But we also saw that age of diagnosis emerged somewhat as a protective factor. So older age of diagnosis was associated with better social perception performance. And across our group as a whole, we found that males performed significantly worse than did females on these social cognitive tasks. So we actually stratified this analysis by males and females, and what we found when we did that was that age of diagnosis only remained significant when we looked exclusively within females. So then thinking about some of the other cognitive indices that might contribute to social outcomes. So as I mentioned before, we looked at attention, memory, processing speed, executive function, and nonverbal reasoning. And what you can see is that the two specific skill sets that emerged as significant predictors of social functioning were deficits in executive function and nonverbal reasoning. And this was above and beyond the contribution of full-scale IQ contribution. So we next looked at social health, and again this was based on self-report, and what you can see here, we expect a mean of 50. So survivors actually were not reporting significant impairment with their social health at all, so weren't reporting issues with companionship, isolation, compared to what we would expect in the normative data. And also when we look at the impairment rate, here we expect an impairment of about 16%, relatively consistent with the exception of social isolation. And what I want to point out with that is when we did a subgroup analysis, the group that was really driving the impairment in social isolation was the no CRT group. So those who weren't treated with radiation, approximately 40% of those were reporting significant social isolation. And with social attainment, these are consistent with past studies, but you can see approximately half the survivors had attained at most a high school education, almost half were unemployed, and just over half were not living independently at the time of the study. And again, these survivors have a median age of 30 years. We next wanted to look at the association between social attainment and actual performance on social cognitive tasks. And what you can see is there's a striking difference between survivors who were employed full-time and those who were not employed full-time. So survivors who performed better on these social tasks were more likely to be employed full-time. And we demonstrated this in a multivariable model, adjusting for IQ, education, age, and sex, where increased performance on each of these social tasks was significantly associated with increased odds of full-time employment. So to wrap up briefly, what we demonstrated was that adult survivors of CNS tumors demonstrate impaired social cognition, and this comes in the form of not being able to recognize facial emotions, having a difficult time understanding tone of voice, and skills that are really critical for maintaining and establishing interpersonal relationships. We found that risk was greatest for infantile tumors treated with CSI, but importantly, this wasn't driven by IQ deficits alone. There were other specific skills such as executive function and nonverbal reasoning that contributed to these outcomes. And notably, we observed that observed impairment or performance-based impairment was worse than self-reported impairment. So this may suggest that survivors who are most compromised intellectually may not have the insight to really appreciate some of the social limitations that they're experiencing. And lastly, and I think perhaps most importantly, is that these social cognitive deficits were associated with reduced attainment outcomes. And this is what we see in the literature of adults with other disabilities as well, that individuals who have difficulty with these social skills really have a hard time being successful within social environments such as the workplace. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the survivors and families who participated, our neuropsychology research team, and the funding provided by St. Jude and ALSAC. Thank you.